How money is created. The truth about money you need to know. All across the world today, we're witnessing central banks pumping money into the system. But here's the thing. From a young age, we're taught that money is scarce, that we need to study, work hard, and earn it over a lifetime. So how is it that so much money can now just appear out of nowhere? Where is it coming from? How is it created? Who ends up paying it back? In this video, we'll break down the 3 main ways money is created and the consequences that follow. You'll also learn where wealth inequality really comes from. If you stick with me until the end, you'll walk away with a clearer understanding of how today's economy truly works. I genuinely want to help people grasp this. It starts off simple, but by the end you'll see how surreal things have actually become. Section 1. Government money. Let's start with the most traditional form of money, the kind created by governments. In reality, this process is handled by central banks and mints, though it's still under government control. This includes physical currency, banknotes, and coins. But here's the catch. Physical cash only makes up a tiny slice of the total money in circulation. In many modern economies, it's just about 3 to 8%. This type of money is created to ensure banks can meet customer demands, like when you withdraw from an ATM. For example, printing a $10 bill might cost around 3 cents. That means the government gains roughly $9.97 in profit per note. This profit is called seigniorage, and it helps reduce the need for taxation. So why don't governments just keep printing cash to pay for everything? The reason has to do with politics. If politicians could create money at will, there'd be huge incentives to overspend, to fund wars, make campaign promises, and buy votes. But printing too much money leads to inflation. The more money there is in circulation, the less value each unit holds. That's the danger. Take inflation to the extreme, and even $1 million might only buy you an apple. When purchasing power erodes like that, money becomes nearly worthless. We've seen this in countries like Venezuela, Argentina, and Zimbabwe. You can think of money as a ruler for measuring value, but it's elastic. The more you stretch it, the less precise it gets. For thousands of years, gold acted as a fixed measuring stick. It kept governments honest. But in 1971, Nixon ended the gold standard in the US, and the dollar, which underpins the global financial system, became untethered. Since then, money has become something far more flexible, and that flexibility has risks. Even though politicians supposedly can't directly create money, money creation is still happening, and that creates problems we'll get into shortly. Recap: governments issue physical money, about 3 to 8% of the total. They profit through seigniorage, which can help cut down taxes. But excessive printing leads to inflation, and that's why they can't just keep printing endlessly. Section 2. Bank-created money through debt. Now we move to the most important and most overlooked source of money today: private banks. In most advanced economies, around 97% of all money exists not as cash, but as digital entries created by private banks. How? Through debt. This goes back centuries. After experiencing frequent bank runs where too many people tried to withdraw money that banks didn't have, laws were changed. Banks convinced lawmakers to allow them to lend more than they actually held in deposits. This is how modern digital money began. It really started gaining traction in 1704 when Britain passed the Promissory Notes Act, which allowed handwritten IOUs to serve as legal money. Those pieces of paper have now become digital debt, but the principle remains the same. A debt note is money, as long as people believe in its value. Today, when you get a bank loan for a mortgage, for instance, the bank doesn't give you money that someone else deposited. It simply types new numbers into your account. That's new money. You now owe them with interest. The seller of the house receives your money and spends it elsewhere, spreading that newly created money into the economy. Here's the kicker. For the borrower, the loan is a debt. For the bank, it's an asset. But both sides treat it as money. This system means more economic growth requires more debt. The real estate sector is particularly important here because mortgages are seen as safe loans. If the borrower can't repay, the bank takes the house. In many countries, like Australia, banks have heavily favored mortgage lending over investing in the real economy. This has driven property prices through the roof and led to massive household debt. We've become addicted to debt. And what about your bank deposits? The moment you deposit money, it technically belongs to the bank. They hold only a fraction of it, traditionally about 10%, and lend out the rest. This process, known as fractional reserve lending, multiplies money throughout the system. In theory, $100 in deposits could lead to $1,000 in total money creation. But in March 2020, the Federal Reserve removed the reserve requirement entirely. Now banks in the US can lend as much as they want with zero reserves. What's more, banks can invest your deposits in risky financial instruments like derivatives, securities, and other speculative bets. These instruments were at the heart of the 2008 financial crisis, when over-leveraged bets brought down banks and nearly collapsed the global economy. The trouble is, nobody really knows how big this derivatives market is. Estimates suggest it could be over $1 quadrillion, more than 10 times the size of the global economy. In good times, this system fuels spending and growth. But once debt becomes too large to manage, defaults rise, lending stops, and recession sets in. This cycle has played out over centuries. But in 2008, we broke the pattern. The financial system had become so intertwined that governments had no choice but to bail out the banks using central banks. Remember, these banks create 97% of the money supply, so if they fail, everything else fails too. Post-2008, the economy has only survived thanks to ultra-low interest rates and emergency interventions. We're in a cycle of short-term gain for long-term instability, and the result is a system that rewards risk-taking, because if it fails, the central bank will bail it out. Recap. Private banks create most of the world's money by issuing debt. This money isn't backed by savings, it's typed into existence. Banks can use your deposits to speculate. And when they lose, central banks step in, putting taxpayers on the hook. Section 3. Central Bank Money, Quantitative Easing. Finally, we arrive at the third and most extreme form of money creation, quantitative easing, or QE. QE was first used by Japan in 1989 and later adopted by the US during the 2008 crisis. The idea is simple. Central banks create new money and use it to buy financial assets, mainly bonds, from banks, corporations, and sometimes the public. It was sold as a one-time emergency measure, but it never stopped. In 2008, the US government approved a $700 billion QE bailout. It was one of the biggest in history. Critics asked, if the Fed can just create money to save Wall Street, why are regular people still paying taxes? That's a fair question, especially since the public ultimately repays these debts through taxes and future austerity. From America's founding in 1776 to 2008, US debt stayed below $1 trillion. By 2014, it had reached $4.4 trillion. Then COVID hit, and $3 trillion was added in just 3 months. These massive bailouts are funded by issuing debt, bonds that are then purchased by central banks which have no savings, just create the money to do it. Can central banks go bankrupt? According to a 2016 report by the European Central Bank, no. They can create as much money as needed to avoid insolvency. And yet, They use that money to buy real assets. The Bank of Japan now owns about 80% of its own stock market. The Swiss National Bank owns billions in US stocks, including Apple and Amazon. It's not hard to see why people are upset. Central banks are creating money out of thin air to buy real assets that generate returns. It's wealth transfer on an epic scale. And it's distorting the markets. The stock market used to reflect economic conditions. Now, thanks to QE, it's increasingly disconnected from reality. Section 4. The disconnect between markets and reality. It's hard to believe, but the total money created by central banks has grown to a size comparable to entire national economies. That alone should raise eyebrows. The absurdity of this situation became painfully clear in April 2020, when over 30 million Americans lost their jobs, yet the stock market posted its best monthly gain since 1987. How? Central banks stepped in and printed trillions of dollars, handing it to commercial banks and hedge funds at near no interest. That cheap money flowed straight into the stock market, not into the real economy where people were suffering. Earlier, we mentioned that creating too much money leads to inflation. So, why didn't we see prices rise everywhere? Well, we did, just not in everyday goods at first. The inflation showed up in asset prices, homes, stocks, and other investments. When newly created money floods into these markets, it drives up prices. And since the wealthiest people tend to own the majority of these assets, they benefited enormously. That's the real cause of today's deepening wealth divide. Most people can feel that something's off. They see the ultra-wealthy getting richer while wages stagnate and prices rise. But they don't always understand why. Let's make it crystal clear with just 3 charts. Since the 1980s, the net worth of the richest individuals has been tightly linked to the stock market. After 2008, that connection became unbreakable. The stock market now moves in step with Federal Reserve money printing. More printed money equals higher asset prices equals greater wealth for the elite. Since 1980, the wealth of the top 0.1% has grown by over 420%. Here's why. When central banks create new money, those who receive it first, wealthy investors, banks get to spend it before prices go up. By the time that money trickles down to the rest of society, inflation has already set in. Economists call this the Cantillon effect. Eventually, experts warn, if the rich begin offloading their assets, selling stocks and real estate, especially in a crisis, that money will finally enter the broader economy. That's when inflation will hit everyday goods hard, because the velocity of money, how quickly money changes hands, will spike. Section 5. The bigger picture and what it means. There's much more to unpack, but let's sum things up so far. Central banks don't need savings. They can't go bankrupt. They create money by buying government bonds, which are essentially promises to repay with interest. That money must eventually be repaid by future taxpayers, either through higher taxes or higher inflation. So, what's the solution? In my view, printing money isn't a real fix. It's a short-term bandage. The real opportunity was missed decades ago. We should have focused on true wealth creation, investing in small businesses, startups, manufacturing, education, innovation, and R&D. But instead, most bank loans went into housing speculation and financial betting. Just imagine if banks had poured billions into productive sectors. How different would the world look today? Sure, investing in businesses or ideas is riskier than real estate, but over time, it leads to more jobs, stronger innovation, and better living standards. And here's the kicker. Governments could then collect more tax revenue without raising taxes because people would simply be earning more. That extra tax could have gone to social programs for those truly in need. Bottom line, You can print money, but you can't print wealth. Real wealth takes time, effort, and productivity. Unfortunately, that route isn't popular these days, and for many nations, it's likely too late. Had we focused on wealth creation before COVID struck, economies wouldn't be as fragile. Households and businesses would have had enough savings to ride out hard times. Just like in the late 20th century, but now, we're left to manage the fallout from a deeply vulnerable system? Section 6. What's next? So where are we headed? In my opinion, something big and unpleasant is on the horizon. I don't know exactly what it'll look like, but over the next decade, we could face a mix of high inflation and low economic growth, what economists call stagflation. We've seen this before in the 1970s, but this time it could be even worse due to record high debt levels and increasing social unrest. Some experts think people may eventually lose trust in the US dollar. Others argue the opposite, that in a world full of collapsing currencies, the dollar could actually strengthen as nations race to exchange their failing money for a more stable one. This idea is known as the dollar milkshake theory. There are also those who put their hopes in digital stablecoins, claiming they'll fix many of today's problems. And then there's modern monetary theory, MMT. According to MMT, governments can keep printing money indefinitely as long as they keep producing enough goods to cover the interest on their debt. In theory, the debt itself never needs to be repaid, just the interest. Whether that works or not, honestly, nobody knows. It's never been fully tested, but to me, it feels like yet another fragile solution in a long line of risky experiments. Interestingly, some small towns have already started taking matters into their own hands. Communities in Venezuela and a town in Italy have issued their own local currencies to stay afloat. Maybe one of these ideas will stick, maybe they won't. Time will tell. But history shows that major crises often lead to breakthrough reforms. As I discovered while writing my book, some of the world's most transformative innovations have come from periods of extreme struggle. Section 7. What can the individual do? So, what should you do? Obviously, this isn't financial advice. I'm not qualified to give that. But if you're concerned, it might be wise to consider converting some of your savings into non-debt-based assets. Think of it as insurance, not investment. If you're older, you may be looking at gold. It's not tied to any central bank, and no one can print more of it. Even the biggest institutions, Bank of America and Goldman Sachs, have acknowledged gold's potential, calling it the money of last resort. In fact, central banks like China and Russia have been quietly stockpiling gold for years. They likely see what's coming. If you're younger, maybe you're drawn to cryptocurrencies. Governments and banks are starting to take blockchain technology seriously, and while the sector is volatile, it could play a bigger role in the future financial system. Or, if you're more of a risk taker, you might choose to ride the wave, studying central bank policies and investing in the assets you believe will benefit from them. I can't tell you what's best. You'll need to do your own research and decide what you believe in. Final thoughts, wrapping it all up. When you really look at how money is created, through government spending, private bank debt, and central bank intervention, it starts to feel almost surreal. Many people are now waking up to the fact that something in the system just isn't working. The problem is, it's so embedded into everything around us that we don't see it anymore. It's invisible until it breaks. And when things started falling apart, people blamed the visible parts. Capitalism, corporations, the rich. But underneath it all lies a far more complex issue. A toxic mix of a debt-based monetary system, runaway financialization, broken incentives, a moral hazard, and the unchecked Cantillon effect. All of this has made the system increasingly fragile, and it's driving the biggest wealth gap we've seen in generations. We don't know what's coming next, but one thing is clear: it's time to ask harder questions about how money really works and who it's really serving. Now that you understand how governments and central banks create money, here's the twist: they're not the biggest players in this game. Private banks, yes, the same ones we trust with our paychecks, are quietly creating the majority of the money in our economy, out of nothing. If that sounds unbelievable, it gets even crazier. Click here to watch how banks magically create money, where we expose the loopholes, legal tricks, and digital magic that make this possible. This is the part of the story most people never hear. But after watching it, you'll never look at your bank the same way again.